right, now we're moving on to sex-linked traits. Now, we haven't covered this at this point. This is probably the first time you've seen it if you haven't been reading ahead or if you didn't have this in high school. But there are things called sex chromosomes, X and Y, and we need to talk about that. You will be doing crosses on this towards the end of the week. We also talk about pedigrees. So here, a pedigree is something you've probably seen if if you've ever looked at somebody's ancestry or something. Like you look at it's like a chart that shows, okay, here are your parents and here are their parents, and you move backwards, and then you end up with basically at the bottom you have all of the youngest people, and then the older people, the people who've passed away, will be up towards the top, and they'll be the great great grandparents or whatever. And so these are pedigrees, and we need to kind of look at this. And you usually do pedigrees in relation to some type of disease, and that's what they're doing here. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease, and what you're doing is you're looking for, in this particular type of problem, carriers. Cystic fibrosis is a recessive allele. So in other words, there's a mutation that causes it. So there's like a big C and a little c, if you want to think of it, cystic fibrosis. And basically, there's a dominant gene and there's a recessive gene. And you're only going to get this if you're homozygous recessive. So in other words, little c. And that's the only way you're going to get it. And so it runs through families. The majority of the people in the family don't have it. But if you marry someone who also is a carrier, in other words, you're heterozygous, you have a big C and a little c, you don't have it, and your mate doesn't have it, but the children have a certain percentage of having it, about 25%, as we've seen with our crosses. So we need to be aware of that. And here we have a pedigree showing who has it and who doesn't. Now this here, let's see, these people, well, okay, I can't highlight it because it's a picture, but the ones where it's black and white, they are carriers. So of course what happened was these two parents, looks like grandparents here, had children, and they had 3 children here, and one was a carrier, and usually the round is a female and the square is a male. So this was the grandfather, and the 3 children, parents here, the 3 children of the grandparents, they had one that inherited the non-diseased alleles, 2 copies of it. But they had one child that had the disease. It was a male, and it had both of the bad alleles. So if it's a little c, they got 2 little c's. So we can tell by this who's recessive, who's dominant, and who's heterozygous. So in other words, the grandparents up here at the top were heterozygous. Their children were one of each. They have homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. Now here, this parent, of course, this child of the grandparents, here we're in like the 2nd generation, and they married another person who was homozygous dominant, and therefore none of their children got the disease. This person did not have children, they had the disease. This person was a carrier, and they married a carrier. Now carrier is heterozygous. So what happened with them? Well, they ended up with what? They ended up with 2 children that had the disease and 2 that did not have the disease. In other words, you can do the cross here, but this would be little c, this would be little c, and these 2 would be 2 big C's. All right, and yes, they give the thing males. Oh, they have it. Yeah, females are the circle and squares are the male. That's the standard method. All right, so be able to do one of these or recognize it. So what would I ask you? I might give you a picture of this and then ask you some multiple choice questions. So I might go, person 3-4, what are they? Homozygous, heterozygous, or homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or homozygous or heterozygous? Well, if we know that cystic fibrosis is it's incomplete dominance, and it's the disease, it's the small letter, so it's the recessive allele, then we know that anybody with the disease is little c, homozygous recessive. So if I ask you what is 3-4 here, well, you would say homozygous recessive. If I ask you 2-5, you would tell me what? You would tell me heterozygous. All right. What are the grandparents? They're both heterozygous. So if I ask you 2-1, you would say homozygous dominant. All right, that's kind of the question you might get. So disease genes can be recessive or dominant, though I will tell you that by far they are recessive. Disease genes that are dominant spread through they're usually not good for you and they make people sick. And you usually run into dominant disease genes. They also can be regular, as we've done, or they can be sex-linked. We haven't done sex-linked yet, but they certainly can be, and so they work a little different when they're sex-linked. They'll pass to males or females differently. Cystic fibrosis is, of course, a disease. As we saw up there, cystic fibrosis is recessive, but there is a disease like Huntington's, which is dominant. So which would you expect to see more in the population? Well, probably the dominant one. So this would be more likely to be a more common disease than that one. That's all it's saying. Let's see. There are diseases that are sex-linked. Color blindness, for instance, can be sex-linked. There are many types of color blindness, but one of them is sex-linked. So let's do Huntington's disease. Now it's a dominant. So all you have to do, if it's a dominant gene, all you have to do is have one big letter and you're going to get it. So mom had, here you had dad had it. So dad may have been big A, little a. We don't know. But mom was certainly little a, or H if it's Huntington disease. So little h. Dad would have been big H, or big H, little h. But if he were big H, since you have to get one of the genes from him, it means all of the children should have had the disease. So we can figure out if dad, our grandfather here, was big H, or big H, little h, heterozygous or homozygous dominant. And of course, some of his children do not have the disease, so that means he must have been heterozygous. That is key to understand this, and this is more likely to be the question I ask. So in other words, we know that grandfather here, by just looking at it, since grandfather didn't have all of his children, since this is a dominant disease, since all of them didn't have it, then that means he was heterozygous. These two, this one here, sorry, just one. This one inherited his little h, but these three inherited his big H, and mom only had little h's to give. So it means each of these is heterozygous. This one is homozygous recessive, this person. Now we look at this, knowing that, again, that means 2-2 is heterozygous, and that means they inherited the big H from their father. Here, this child inherited the big H from her mother. All right, and again, so you have to realize that this is a sex-linked trait, and it only no, this is not a sex-linked trait. This is a dominant trait, and it leads to a disease, and we can use the number of offspring to tell what the parents are. So understand that if this person had been homozygous dominant, all of their children would have had the disease, because they can only give a big H, and it only takes one big H to get this particular disease. All right, you really need to understand that. There will definitely be a question similar to this. All right, sex chromosomes and X-linked inheritance. Now, not all organisms use X and Y. You'll need to read on the book on this. Maybe I can give you some additional videos to watch on YouTube. But we humans are X and Y. In fact, mammals are. Insects are XO, and birds and fish are something called ZW. So in our system, if you were born with an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, you are male. If you are female, you have two X's. All right. Specifically, we have two. You get one from mom and one from dad, and dad has an X and a Y. If you inherit the X from dad, then you're going to be female. If you inherit the Y from dad, you're going to be male. From mom, all you get is one of her X's. She doesn't have two to give you. She only has two X's. And if you get the X from her and the X from dad, then you're female. Well, you get an X from her and a Y from dad, then you're going to be male. And that's the difference, and you need to understand that. We won't go into much detail with the insects and the birds and fish. Just to realize that females are like us, they have two X's. Males just have a single X, or we call it XO. All right. In other words, two X's make you a female, one X makes you a male. In the ZY, it's similar to ours, but males are the ones that counteract females. If you have two Z's, you're a male. If you have a ZW, you're a female in a bird or a fish. So it leads to slightly different things. We will be doing sex-linked traits, but we will stick primarily to mammals. We won't. You need to know that other systems exist, but for the test, you only need to know how mammals work. Not all organisms use sex chromosomes. Some are haploid and diploid. So in other words, if you inherit one chromosome, that is kind of like the insect, where you inherit only one, and you are. So this is kind of the type of system that they're working at here. And this is a bee, so it is an insect. So that's what they're getting at here. The sex is controlled by the environment. This is different. Often reptiles will do this. Like if you want the particular sex of alligator, you just keep the eggs warmer or cooler, and you'll end up with all males or all females in your alligators or crocodiles, because the temperature at which the eggs stay determine their sex. It's complicated, but it's a completely different system than what we use. Plants can be complicated, and we probably won't talk much about plants. You need to take a course in plant anatomy or plant physiology to get into it. But plants can be both male and female at the same time, so it's a little bit more complicated. But they do have sex. A lot of plants do. Some plants are asexual. In fact, all of them can usually reproduce in some way. They essentially can clone themselves, but they also can actually reproduce sexually with seeds and pollen. Pollen would be the equivalent of sperm in a mammal, and then they have what we call an ovule, which is more like a undeveloped seed. And once it gets fertilized by the pollen, it becomes a gamete, and which is a full-blown seed, which can grow into a plant. But not all plants do this. It's more complicated in plants, actually, than humans, as you might someday, if you study plants, you'll find that they have a lot more genes than we do. And technically, at a genetic level, at a gene level, plants are far more complicated than mammals. They react to the environment through turning on and off genes. So if it gets dry or hot, they're stuck where they are, and all they can do is change the genes they have. They turn them on and turn them off. When we get thirsty or we get hot, we get up and walk away. We go look for water. We move around. Plants don't. And plants have developed the ability to alter the genes that they are using at any given time to adapt to the environment. So plants are really interesting, and they have more complex genetics um, than humans, or than animals or mammals. Don't worry too much about this one. It's just a graphic for what we just learned. Now, when traits are on the X and Y chromosome, we call them X-linked or sex-linked. So realize that if we go up here and we realize that human females have two X's, all right, and so they have two copies of the genes that are on the X chromosome, whereas males only have one X. Actually, we should be up here. We only have one X, and these two chromosomes, the X and the Y, all right, excuse me, the X and the Y are not identical. They are not homologous, all right? There are different genes on the Y than there are on the X. Females get two copies like a normal chromosome, but in the case of humans, human male, you only get one copy of all the genes on the X. So if you've got a mutation on here, you don't have a backup copy. The great thing about having two copies is, okay, especially with something like a recessive disease, if you have a recessive disease, well, you've got another copy and it's probably a good one, and so you cover it up. Males don't have that. If you receive a recessive trait from your mother, all right, and it's a disease gene, you're going to get it because you don't have a backup copy over here. You have some unique genes in males because now the Y chromosome is very tiny, it's not very big, and it doesn't have many genes, but these are unique to males. So these are genes that are singularly male, and female humans won't have these. All right, so now we'll move on here. So X-linked traits, we have to learn about those, and we haven't done crosses with those, but we will. But here's how you do it. Generally, you put an X, and you put, it's just like the others, except for you put the gene, the big H or the little h or whatever, as a subscript or a superscript onto the X chromosome. Now, of course, this is a different gene, so it doesn't exist here, so there's no H here. So here you have, this is obviously a female because there are two X's. Now, this female is heterozygous. She has a big H and a little h. And the male, of course, has a big H, so it's dominant. And there is no. So here's a key point to remember. With sex-linked traits, males are always, what? They can never be heterozygous. They are always just big H or little h. They're either dominant or recessive. You don't have to say homozygous or heterozygous. They are simply dominant or recessive. So a sex-linked trait on the X chromosome, and you're talking about the male, then they're just dominant or recessive. Over here, it's the normal way. So this is heterozygous, right? There can be no heterozygous male gametes. In other words, there can be no big H, little h, because you've only got one chromosome with the H on it. So now let's cross this and figure out what our children are. Well, here we have an X and an X, so those two X's come together into a female. And here we have an X and a Y, so that's a male. So we have something added when we do sex-linked traits. Not only do you have to tell me that they're big H here, but you also have to tell me they're female. So this is one female homozygous dominant individual. So it's big H, the disease is little h, so this is an unaffected female, no disease. This is a big H and a Y, so it's like H and O, it doesn't exist. So this is also a normal male, no disease. Here, you have a female who has a big H, but she also has a little h, but this is dominant, the big H is dominant. The disease here does not show up because you have a big H and it covers it up. But it is female, this person. Now, this person is male, but this person doesn't have anything over here. All they have is the little h, so they end up with the disease. So males, there's in sex-linked traits, baldness is one of these. It's a sex-linked, passes through your mother, and essentially, if you're female, you get a backup copy. All right. So you might inherit baldness gene, but you have a big H to cover it up, and so therefore you don't go bald. There are women who are little h, and it occurs, and they have to wear wigs. It's far more common than you might think. They don't go bald all at once. They usually, in their 30s, they start losing their hair, just like men, and they'll end up being bald, and they wear wigs the rest of their life. And it happens in a significant number of people. It's something like 10 or 12%. It's huge. And so there are a lot of people out there in their older than 30 that are wearing wigs that you don't realize because they have this trait. Now, the male, this particular one, this is really bad in the case of males because it means males don't get this backup copy to cover it up. So you see a lot of diseases that are sex linked, and you'll almost always see them in male. You rarely see it in the females. So that's why you see so many bald men. All right. And I am one of those. So, all right. Hemophilia is another. I will let you read that one. And Thomas Morgan, just know that he studied flies, and he studied them on the sex chromosome, and he's the one who kind of figured out that you have to invent the sex-linked cross. So without him, we wouldn't have it was confusing at the time, and he figured out, oh, this is because of this problem with the chromosomes, and he figured out sex-linked crosses and came up with sex-linked traits. All right, you might want to read about his experiments. It will be a superficial. I would probably just ask you a multiple choice question on Morgan. What did he discover, and or something about his experiment maybe. So if you get the idea of what he did, you should be in pretty good shape. It'll be a multiple choice. It won't be something like a short answer that you'd have to explain a lot. But realize that he's the one who located disease genes on X chromosomes, and realized that was why you got the strange cross numbers that weren't the same between males and females. In other words, the males got it a lot more often than the females, and he figured out what we just talked about up here with this, and why the males are more likely to get it. All right, now this is your fourth set of slides. We have a couple more coming up.